One of the things that we've learned that what we're talking about may not have actually existed. But we also know that the debate over whether it existed or not, and where it existed and how it existed, is something both ancient and current. And in between the ancient and the current, there is also considerable debate. And it is to that debate that we're now going to turn. And Jacob Lassner is going to lead us there. He needs no introduction, but nevertheless, protocol requires. He is the Klutznick Professor of Jewish Civilization here at Northwestern. He's a very well-known author who's done a whole variety of books from ancient or historic Baghdad. It's a wonder that he isn't on CNN more often. To the Queen of Sheba, which suggests that he ought to be on the Entertainment Network. But fortunately, he appears here and at many other very important forums in this country, in Europe, and in Israel. And it is from his vast fund of scholarship that we're going to hear him speak in really a two-part presentation. This is but the first part of it. And it is called Muslim Responses to the Sanctity of the Temple Mount, Anti-Jewish and Christian Polemics. So, Jack, can you all see him? The reason is the lighting from here is absolutely awful. And Jack will, can you see Jack Lassner? This is like the Temple Mount. He's lower than where he ought to be.
As I remarked, hoping to be jocular last evening, I have reached incipient old age, and at that stage, the hearing goes and the eyesight also goes. So I now wear two sets of glasses and can't read with either one of these glasses. And this is compounded here because I can't even see what I have before me. Needless to say, now that I'm reading my reading glasses, I can't see you at all, but that's not my problem. It's not your problem either. The real problem is the text that's sitting in front of me, and I'm afraid I'm going to have to hunch over somewhat, which is, of course, a terrible thing to do as an audience. It goes against all the rules. One's supposed to make eye contact, but unfortunately, that's going to be the situation. I should point out that the slot in the program was to have been taken up by someone else. There was to have been a presentation on the walls of Jerusalem in modern times. The presenter was to have been Professor Bernard Wasserstein, who just accepted an endowed chair at that university to the south in Chicago after a distinguished career in Brandeis, Oxford, and the University of Glasgow. Alas, Bernard discovered that the university that he now serves, with its characteristic efficiency, scheduled him to teach a seminar on the Arab-Israel problem at precisely this time, something that, needless to say, never would have happened at a properly run university like Northwestern. There is an expression in Yiddish, "Man kann nicht tanzen auf zwei chasanas." You can't dance at two weddings simultaneously, but you can dance twice at the same wedding. And so I've been called upon to do double duty and will present a paper this morning and another paper in the afternoon session. Had he been here, I believe that Bernard would have spoken of the way Palestinian Arabs have reacted to the symbolic use of Jerusalem's architecture by Zionists during the period of the British Mandate and since the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. Most specifically, he would have focused on the western wall of the Temple Mount, the most sacred spot of all for world Jewry. I trust that no one will be excessively disappointed if, instead of focusing on the here and now, I will turn to an earlier period and an earlier Arab reaction to Jewish veneration of the Temple Mount, and beyond that, to an unusual and little-studied Muslim response to the sanctification of Jerusalem. Most of us take it for granted that from the beginnings of Islam, Jerusalem has always been a city sacred to three monotheist faiths. That may be true in part, but a close study of medieval Arabic sources reveals that Muslim attitudes towards Jerusalem and their reaction to Jewish and Christian attitudes towards Jerusalem is a far more complex picture that many, if not all, but a very few scholars imagine. My intention here is to stir the waters, if ever so slightly, and to try to recover these early Muslim attitudes. What this means for the present and future politics of the city and the region is left for the discussion to follow. We are all aware of the numerous texts which accord Jerusalem a very special status in the history of Islam. Venerating Jerusalem allowed Muslims to undertake pilgrimages, perform pious devotions in the city, just as they did in the holy cities of Western Arabia. That Jerusalem was, in certain respects, the equal of Mecca and Medina, epitomized by a comment attributed to the Prophet Muhammad himself, and that comment was, as regards pilgrimage, لَتُشَدُّ الرِّحَالِ إِلَى الثَّلَاثَةِ مَسَاجِدِ. As regards pilgrimage, you shall set out for 3 mosques only: Al-Masjid al-Haram, the sacred mosque of Mecca; Masjidi, this mosque of mine in Medina; Wal-Aqsa, and the Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. There are, however, other accounts which paint a surprisingly different picture, a picture that is not yet fully understood, let alone explained by historians of early Islam. In contrast to the many accounts listing the virtues or the fadail of Jerusalem, the accepted wisdom of most Muslims, there are concurrent sources which tend to downplay and in certain instances undermine completely the sanctity of that holy city. In one of these anti-Jerusalem traditions, the Prophet is said to declare, the mosques which deserve most to be visited, that is in performing the rites of pilgrimage, are the Masjid al-Haram in Mecca and my mosque in Medina. A prayer in my mosque is better than 1,000 in any other mosque except that of Mecca. Now, one cannot help but note that in this particular version discussing the worthiness of mosques, there is no mention at all of the Aqsa Mosque, the Jerusalem Mosque on the Temple Mount. In other variants of the second tradition, the Aqsa Mosque, although mentioned, is reported as worth only 50 or at best 500 prayers as compared to up to 100,000 in the Masjid al-Haram. Whatever the case, each and every variant of the second tradition degrades the Aqsa in relation to the great mosques of Arabia. And yet partisans of Jerusalem might have discovered a silver lining in what appears at first glance to be an egregious insult to the veneration of their city, whose very name in Arabic, Al-Quds or Bayt al-Maqdis, signifies its purported holiness. Despite the stated preference for the mosques of Mecca and Medina, there is nothing in this particular tradition, not even in the version which omits all mention of the Aqsa, that explicitly denies the sanctity of Jerusalem. Nor does the tradition categorically state that Muslims are forbidden from fulfilling the rites of pilgrimage on the Temple Mount. Quite the opposite. The expression deserve most to be visited implies that at least one other mosque could be visited for purposes of pilgrimage. And why not? The Prophet himself spoke of setting out for 3 mosques, the Aqsa in Jerusalem being one of them. That is to say, the holy city might well do for those Muslims unable to make the arduous journey all the way to the Hijaz, that is, to Western Arabia. As if to leave no doubt that the mosque in Jerusalem is inferior to those in Mecca and Medina, and beyond that ought not to be considered a proper place of pilgrimage, a less ambiguous anti-Jerusalem text has the Prophet declaring, you shall set out on pilgrimage for only 2 mosques, the Mosque of Mecca and the Mosque of Medina. One could hardly ask for a more explicit statement. Similarly, the Caliph Umar ibn Khattab, a contemporary of the Prophet, is said to have struck 2 men when he discovered them performing the rites of pilgrimage in Jerusalem, or to be more specific, he lashed them because that is what he believed they were doing. When they explained in their defense that they were only saying the usual prayers incumbent on all Muslims, and that their ultimate destination was to perform a proper pilgrimage at the holy sites of Arabia, he let them be. In certain circumstances, merely praying in Jerusalem could and did lead to disapproval, if not outright condemnation. On the day of his triumphal entry into Mecca, the Prophet was reportedly approached by a man who said, Ya Rasulullah, O Messenger of God, I vow to pray in Jerusalem should you enter Mecca. The Meccan is thus pictured as seeking the Prophet's blessing in carrying out his vow. Muhammad nevertheless replied, Salli hunaka, pray here, that is in Mecca. Clearly an attempt to dissuade the Muslim from acting on his vow to go to Jerusalem. The man persisted, however, and the Prophet was forced to reply as he did the first time, Salli hunaka, pray here. It was only when the man spoke up a third time that the Prophet allowed him to make the decision for himself. It would seem that Muhammad clearly preferred that such individual prayers be recited in Mecca, but he did not prohibit private devotional prayers in Jerusalem if reciting these prayers was meant to fulfill a vow taken to God. The ambiguous response of the Prophet recorded in this account reflects a lively debate within the leading Muslim schools of law. Among legal scholars, the question arises, is one obligated to recite individual prayers and otherwise perform devotional acts in Jerusalem if one has vowed to do so? Most authorities maintain that having taken a vow to God, the obligation was binding. A minority said that it was not, diminishing thereby the importance of Jerusalem as a holy site. However, that second opinion, which denied the obligatory power of vows to perform devotional acts in the holy city, did not in and of itself prohibit such acts outright. As I understand it, the issue is not prayers in Jerusalem per se, but the force of the vow. That being so, the legal discussion did not go far enough to please those Muslims who wanted to condemn any attempt that might be construed as sanctifying Jerusalem. In his Qaida fi Ziyarat Bayt al-Maqdis, a short treatise devoted to the rules governing religious visits to Jerusalem, the Muslim zealot Ibn Taymiyyah, who I add parenthetically is the intellectual guru of modern Islamic revivalists, this Ibn Taymiyyah takes issue with both the majority and the minority opinion. In contrast to those scholars who generally respect, if not trumpet, the special sanctity of Jerusalem, Ibn Taymiyyah undermines completely the veneration of the holy sites and its environs. He maintains that Jerusalem cannot in any way be considered a center of pilgrimage. At best, one is allowed a religious visit to Jerusalem in order to pray there, but not as a result of having vowed to do so. In this formulation of Ibn Taymiyyah, the question of whether a vow is obligatory or not is rendered irrelevant. Muslims are enjoined not to say prayers in Jerusalem if they had specifically vowed to do so. In that respect, Ibn Taymiyyah was more strict than the Prophet, who tried to dissuade a Muslim follower from fulfilling his vow and saying his prayers in Jerusalem, but in the end allowed him to make that choice as part of his own decision. Nor, according to Ibn Taymiyyah, can one even fulfill a vow to spend time on a religious retreat within the city, a favorite activity of well-known Muslim pietists and mystics. It were as though visiting Jerusalem to fulfill a vow is profane behavior that misuses a sacred act. Were these restrictions not sufficient to degrade the religious significance of Jerusalem, Ibn Taymiyyah contends that a visit to the city cannot be combined with the pilgrimage to Mecca, presumably because in the holy month one might be seen as fulfilling a visit, or in visiting Jerusalem one might be seen as fulfilling the rites of pilgrimage, that is to say, the rites of the Hajj. As he had been stricter than the Prophet as regards praying in Jerusalem to fulfill a vow, Ibn Taymiyyah now shows himself to be more strict than the righteous Caliph Omar when it comes to visiting the city in the time of pilgrimage, en route to the Hijaz. Ibn Taymiyyah goes on to say that the violation of any of these rules governing visits to Jerusalem is tantamount to a renunciation of Islam. To go to Jerusalem in order to fulfill a personal vow, be it to offer devotional prayers, or to go on a religious retreat, or even to formally visit the city while en route to Mecca as a pilgrim, makes one nothing less than an unbeliever. Now, this is no small accusation. Any Muslim turned infidel in this manner is called upon to repent or face death, all that for holding Jerusalem and other venerated sites outside of Arabia excessively sacred. However excessive they may seem to us, and however jarring we may think them to be as regards Muslim sensibilities, the fact of the matter is that these negative comments are not random statements. They echo an early and sustained Muslim debate on the significance of historic Palestine as a holy land. Now, all of this arcane discussion raises an obvious and extremely important question for this conference. What is it about the sanctification of Palestine and of Jerusalem in particular that so exacerbated the sensitivities of certain religious scholars? What possible objection could there have been to declaring an area already so rich in religious significance a Muslim holy land? What harm was there in vowing to perform devotional acts in a place that had been sacred since almost time immemorial? No doubt there was something subversive about sanctifying this particular city and the land in which it was situated. What could that have been? The more stringent protectors of the faith were surely aware that the traditions favoring Jerusalem, the so-called Fadail of Quds texts, are not always neutral in the way they present the shrines of Arabia. In some accounts, it is not sufficient to simply declare the city atop Mount Zion the equal of Mecca and Medina, a place where one can perform rites of pilgrimage as one did in the Hijaz. That might have been acceptable. The presumed difficulty lay in statements, including traditions attributed to the Prophet himself, statements that go so far as to indicate a decided preference for the area of the Temple Mount and more generally for the Holy Land over Arabia, which was, after all, the crucible of Islam. For example, we are reminded by partisans of the Holy City that God sent Lot and Abraham to Jerusalem so that it might be a blessing for all nations, which is a rather elastic reading of Quran 21:71. We delivered him, meaning Abraham and Lot, to the land of Canaan, which we have blessed for all humankind. The Quranic verse itself is loosely linked to Genesis 12:1-4. You will remember in that famous series of passages in the Hebrew Bible, God instructs Abraham to leave the land of his birth, Moladitecha, and the house of his father, Beit Avicha, for Canaan, the future land of Israel. God then promises to make a mighty nation out of Abraham's progeny and to see to it that all the nations of the earth shall be blessed thereby. And so Abraham set forth for Canaan with his nephew Lot as God commanded him. Given the support of Scripture, both Jewish and Muslim, the prophet in this pro-Jerusalem account enjoins all Muslims to emigrate to Jerusalem, as did Abraham and Lot at God's behest. It may seem strange at first glance, but that is what the prophet does in this account, written by Muslims who were partisans of Jerusalem's sanctity. In a rather whimsical aside, I might declare the prophet in this particular tradition some sort of a proto-Zionist. There is nothing innocuous about this startling tradition. And mentioning the biblical patriarch in a text that calls for Muslims to emigrate to Palestine is filled with meaning that runs over. To so closely identify Abraham with historic Palestine, as in the Hebrew Bible, goes against the grain of the dominant Muslim counter-narrative which attempts to root monotheism not in Canaan as in the Bible, but in the Arabian Peninsula. Muslims declare that Abraham, the first monotheist according to the Hebrew Bible, established the Kaaba, the central shrine of Mecca, and the holiest of all Muslim sites. Accepting that, there can be no mistaking the chronology of monotheism's two oldest shrine centers. The sanctity of Mecca, established by Abraham, preceded that of Jerusalem, whose temple was built by Solomon many generations later. A point made explicit in Muslim accounts comparing the two places and more generally contrasting Arabia with the Holy Land to the north, that is Palestine. When asked about monotheist places of worship, Muhammad is said to have indicated that the earliest was established by Abraham at Mecca, the second by Solomon at Jerusalem, and that 40 years separated one from the other. The tradition puzzled Muslim authors, their sense of chronology being closer to the Hebrew Bible and modern opinion. They correctly placed Abraham more than 1,000 years prior to Solomon. The point is nevertheless clear. As with many accounts previously cited, Jerusalem was sacred, but the Arabian mosque built around the shrine first established by Abraham, that is before Solomon built the temple, was the most sacred of all. Linking Abraham to Arabia also goes hand in hand with traditions Arabicizing the patriarch's eldest son Ishmael, the child born to Hagar, his wife Sarah's Egyptian handmaid. Muslims believe that Ishmael, although himself not of Arab birth, was first sheltered and then raised among the Arabs when Sarah, hitherto barren, that is to say the matriarch of the future matriarch of the Israelites, but then barren, insisted on having both the mother and child cast out of Abraham's household in a moment of jealous pique. Having become an honorary Arab, so to speak, thanks to Sarah's uncharitable behavior and God's having altered Ishmael's uvula so that he could in an instant speak flawless Arabic even as a puny infant, Ishmael's election to the Arab nation has long-range implications. With God's intervention, Ishmael was destined to become the progenitor of the prophet's family and thus of the prophet himself. With Muhammad's mission, the defeat of the idol worshippers of Mecca, history turned full cycle, and the link between monotheism, the Arabs, and Mecca, a tie first established Abraham when he himself established the shrine of that city many generations earlier, was fully restored. This connection between the Hijaz, that is, between Western Arabia and monotheism, is no small matter in the historical consciousness of Muslims. The Arabization of monotheism was central to Islam's debate with Jews and Christians. Unlike the Arabs, who revere their native Arabian lands and its holy cities, the Jews, Abraham's subsequent progeny by way of Sarah's grandson Jacob, resonate to a history linked to the land of Israel and the temple built by Solomon in Jerusalem. Now, Muslims were well aware of the broad outlines of the Jewish narrative, with its emphasis on the land promised Abraham's Israelite offspring. But for Muslims, the more important connection is that of Abraham to the Kaaba and that of his son Ishmael's progeny to the subsequent history of Mecca and its environs. Given these declared links to Arabia, there would seem to be something subversive in Muslim accounts stressing the sanctity of Jerusalem and historic Palestine, especially when such traditions extol the virtue of Muslims emigrating to what Jews proudly declare their promised land. In all likelihood, Muslims loyal to Arabia, home to the most genuine Islam of all, sought to diminish the sanctity of historic Palestine, lest the Muslim faithful be confused by an old Israelite tale that should have been superseded by a newer and more authentic monotheist narrative, namely the mission and missive of Muhammad's last and quintessential messenger. In order to break completely with certain aspects of the Israelite past, it would appear that Muslim scholars recast many of the pro-Jerusalem traditions to denigrate the so-called virtues of the city. When pro-Jerusalem scholars declared that anyone praying in the Aqsa emerges sinless as on the day on which he was born, a countervailing view was advanced by the champions of Arabia. In this recast tradition, the reward of emerging sinless after prayer was reserved for those visiting the great mosque of Mecca. When the prophet, in praise of Jerusalem, reportedly declares, prayer in the mosque of Jerusalem is worth 1,000 prayers in any other, an anti-Jerusalem tradition reverses these sentiments in order to extol the virtues of Mecca and Medina. For those who were offended by texts favoring the holy city and its Temple Mount, there was much indeed to contest. How presumptuous it was for avowedly pious Muslims to reserve for the Temple Mount and its mosque a status that not only equaled but exceeded that of the holy sites in Arabia. What were Muslims to make of traditions which declare that should a person enter the Aqsa Mosque and request a special favor of God that he had not asked for in any other mosque, not so veiled reference to the mosques of Mecca and Medina, God would grant that request immediately. Not surprisingly, here too there is a counter-tradition favoring the Mosque of the Prophet and the religious preeminence of the Arab heartland. We should also note a series of apocalyptic traditions glorifying Jerusalem and the Holy Land at the expense of Mecca and Medina, the sacred precincts of Arabia. In these accounts, the rebuilding of Jerusalem's temple in the end of days will be accompanied by the destruction of Yathrib, a reference to the ancient name by which Medina was known before the advent of Islam. That cataclysmic occurrence will be set into motion on the final day of judgment, an event also marking the resurrection and ingathering of the dead. On that fateful occasion, the Kaaba, the holy shrine of Mecca, and all the pilgrims who have gone there will join the throngs that gather in Jerusalem, as will all the mosques in which prayers are being offered to Allah, a sort of cosmic transmigration of the living and dead, as well as the sacred places that worship God. On that day, too, the bones of Muhammad will be transported from his grave at Medina to be united with those prominent Israelites buried in the Holy Land. That is to say, Muhammad will be temporarily reposed with the likes of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the Israelite patriarchs, as well as with the matriarchs Sarah, Rebecca, and Leah, and Rachel, all of whom are buried in the hillside of Judea. In this picture of the coming Messianic age, a picture most reminiscent of traditional Jewish visions of the end of days, Jerusalem, called the sort of the dunya, the navel of the universe, completely upstages the birthplace of the prophet. The deflation of the holy sites of Arabia in these and similar accounts may explain the rather hostile reaction to the literature and praise of Jerusalem. But we could argue there is more to consider as regards the anti-Jerusalem tradition. It is widely discussed in the literature, medieval as well as modern, that the Arab-Muslim sanctification of Jerusalem was part and parcel of a contest for legitimacy that extended beyond regional conflicts within the Islamic community itself. In sanctifying the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, Muslims also searched for effective religious symbols with which to combat the rich iconic tradition of the Byzantine Empire and the lingering and powerful impact of Christianity and Judaism in the Holy Land. The search for such symbols also reflected tensions between Muslims and contemporaneous Jews. It reflected as well the concerns of early Jewish and Christian converts to Islam, those new Muslims from among the indigenous inhabitants of Arabia and Syria-Palestine, and then those converts who lived in other provinces and regions of an expanding Islamic state. How are we to understand these tensions? In sanctifying Jerusalem and other places within historic Palestine, the Muslims did not create holiness out of nothing. The city and the land were already sacred. Jewish law continue to be a major center of the Christian faith. Consider an account in Thalabi's Qisas al-Anbiya, the most detailed Muslim exploration of ancient Israelite and early Christian history. No sooner does Solomon finish building the temple than Thalabi has him set off to perform the rites of pilgrimage in the sacred land, Arabically Ard al-Haram. Invoking the expression sacred land, the Muslim author clearly means Mecca. Similarly, the rites of pilgrimage which are described are the rites of pilgrimage which would have been performed by a Muslim in the time of the author himself. This juxtaposition of two events, the building of the Temple of Jerusalem and Solomon's need to fulfill the obligations of pilgrimage in Arabia, is not coincidental. By going to Mecca immediately after completing the temple in Jerusalem, the Israelite acknowledges the primacy of Muhammad's future birthplace and its ancient shrine. Were that not enough, Solomon informs his entire entourage of the prophet's future mission, an event he says is foretold in Jewish scripture. In any event, that's what Solomon claims in this Muslim account. On another occasion, a journey from Persepolis, a city in western Persia, to the Yemen, a place in South Arabia, Solomon is said to have stopped off in Medina, and there, at the second of the sacred precincts of Arabia, the Israelite once again informs his entourage of Muhammad's future coming. He says this site will be a site, a settlement of a prophet at the end of time, a Dar Hijrah at the Akhir Zaman. Should there be any doubt of Solomon's prophetic vision, our source points out that God himself will give special sanctity to Medina. There, at the end of time, Allah will reveal an Arabic Quran and send forth the most beloved of his prophets. So the question raised by this kind of literature is, why is it then that contemporaneous Jews deny the legitimacy of Muhammad's vocation and the sacredness of Arabia when it was also clearly revealed to Solomon and to the Israelites before them? It is all too evident that various anti-Jerusalem traditions serve not only to preserve the religious primacy of Arabia, but they also serve as a powerful polemic against the Jews and by extension also Christians. In light of what they surely must know, they have been forewarned of Muhammad's coming by all their prophets. How is it that these earlier monotheists reject God's messenger and venerate their lost temple and formerly sovereign land instead of the holy sites of Arabia? The anti-Jerusalem traditions go on to depict the Jews as purveyors of false statements, accounts forged to promote Jerusalem so as to make that city equal to Mecca and Medina. Perhaps the most famous of these attacks against the Jews refers to the legendary Ka'b al-Akhbar, reportedly a rabbi who was an early convert to Islam and Muhammad's learned informant regarding Jews and Judaism. When the Caliph Umar ibn Khattab was about to build the first Muslim mosque on the Temple Mount, Ka'b is said to advise him concerning the orientation of the building. Ka'b suggested that the mosque be built in such a way that a worshipper could face both Mecca and the site of the ruined Jewish temple at the same time. The wise Umar saw through the rules and accused the former rabbi of residual inclinations towards his Jewish heritage. It was convenient for the opponents of Jerusalem to focus on God, as he is reportedly the source of many traditions that favor sanctifying the city. It goes without saying that his Jewish origins made it all the easier for them to accuse him. Even scholars who favored Jerusalem were wary of transmitters who copied Jewish traditions for their own purposes. Deeply embedded in the anti-Jerusalem traditions, there is then a pronounced animus against the Jews and Judaism. However much the Jews and their rejection of Muhammad represented a problem for Muslims, there is still another dimension to the anti-Jerusalem and anti-Holy Land traditions of the time. So many locations of historic Palestine were identified with the workings of the Holy. That holds true for Christians as well as Jews, perhaps even more so. The land itself was visited by all sorts of ascetics and beloved by various groups of pietists. When the Muslims conquered the north, they came upon a land that already had an extraordinary and well-defined religious landscape. Can we then assume, as we have earlier suggested, that the local pietism might have affected the Muslims, who shared broadly with Jews and Christians a common monotheist tradition, including a veneration of biblical personalities? If so, can we also assume that sites held sacred by Jews and Christians now become sacred to some of the Muslim conquerors, at least in the realm of popular religion. Following that, may we assume still again that converts to Islam from among the former Jews and Christians were not likely to abandon old allegiances to specific places or inspiring ceremonies associated with places deemed sacred. So many studies of the veneration of saints in the Near East and elsewhere suggest an obvious answer to these series of queries. The Muslim conquerors of Palestine were enveloped by the earliest sanctity of that land and the popular practices related to that sanctity, including the law and practices associated with Jerusalem's Temple Mount. The same Muslim authorities were therefore very much puzzled. For some Muslim authorities, there was an obvious danger that the Islam of Muhammad, which was linked ever so directly to Arabia, would be compromised by strange and foreign elements. Ibn Taymiyyah is explicit in condemning extravagant veneration of tombs of the Israelite prophets, especially religious sites that are also venerated by unbelievers, that is to say, by the Jews and the Christians. So on the one hand, he is explicitly against the veneration of saints of Israelite prophets that have been, in a sense, incorporated into the worldview of the Muslims, and he is especially condemning of those particular sites that are still venerated by Jews and Muslims. He is very, very clear about the danger in visiting such sites when non-Muslims are present and actually performing religious rites. But he recognizes that visiting such sacred sites is not absolutely prohibited, except where graven images are displayed, which is, of course, a reference to sites visited often by Christians. It is clear that Ibn Taymiyyah and earlier Muslim scholars were much concerned with the residual power of the Holy Land sacred history. We might add parenthetically that concurrent with the debate on the sanctity of Jerusalem and historic Palestine was an active debate on whether Muslims ought to study the traditions of the Israelites and or utilize informants who had not yet converted to the faith. As a matter of course, the greatest danger found in such circumstances was the attraction to something that is both shared and familiar, but not quite the same, hence a subject for confusion. The early Muslims appropriated the history of a more ancient monotheism as their own and redefined that history to suit their own needs. There was, however, an obvious reluctance on the part of the same Muslims to become directly acquainted with Jewish and or Muslim versions of monotheism. The debate was resolved temporarily when it was deemed that the Israelite traditions, properly understood, foretold the coming of Muhammad and predicted various elements in the later history of Islam. Still, the authorities who were responsible for defending the Islamic faith against religious slippage had to be on guard, lest popular religion lead the faithful astray and, of course, undercut their own authority. There's always been a tension between the guardians of the law and those who practice religion less formally. The sanctification of historic Palestine may well be tied to that tense relationship. Nevertheless, the sanctity of the land took hold, despite the likes of Ibn Taymiyyah. Historic Palestine became a favorite place for Muslim mystics and pietists, and Jerusalem became a very special city, as was Mecca and Medina.
Thank you very much, Jack. It's now our turn to comment on this rich trove of insights that we've heard this morning. So someone who would like to begin? The gentleman to my right. Michael Kirko, and turn around the link to the LLC, and there's Martin Davis.
This is kind of a, on the one hand, on the other hand, comment on your paper. I think that one issue potentially is presuming that necessarily there will be a logical connection between the uses of archaeology or the misuses of archaeology or the uses of biblical texts or the misuses of biblical texts and what happens in the wider political arena. And I guess what I would like to say is is, despite the impeccable scholarship of your paper, it seems to me that those of us who are historians or political scientists are nonetheless confronted with another reality, which is the profound Israeli archaeological political uses of archaeology, going back to Yadin and Moshe Dayan and all of the sort of professional and or amateur archaeologists are destroyers of archaeological treasures, depending on your perspective, and continuing right down to the present day on the Israeli side with commentators like Ze'ev Herzog at Tel Aviv University, for example. And I simply report that 2 years ago at the Association for Israel Studies, the most attended session was a session that Herzog and I did on political uses of biblical texts. Logically, what we were doing may or may not connect with the history of the event. But if you will, there is a historical reality created by the uses or misuses of history, whether we like it or not. And the same thing is true, by the way, on the Palestinian side. The argument about who got there when has profound ideological implications. Or on the other hand, the attempt in the 1950s of at least some Israelis to reinvent their own mythos as Canaanites, to get rid once for all of the notion of the subservient Jew. None of this is to deny what you're saying in your paper, but rather to try and press a little bit, situating it in a context which is historical and political as over and against scholarly, biblical, and archaeological. And I just offer that as a comment.
Go ahead now. I suspect, do other people want to speak to that point?
Yes.
Yes, Martin. Jacobs.
Okay. To add on that point, at the outset, sorry.
Martin Jacobs from Washington
Yeah,
University.
so I'm referring to Benjamin Sommer's paper as well. At the outset, you referred shortly to Arafat's remarks on the Temple Mount and questioning that a Jewish temple, or at least the first temple, had been standing there, and then you came to the so-called minimalist theories and to some discussions in archaeology. And I do fully agree with you that from a scholarly point of view, this does not question Jewish nationhood. But I would like to draw the attention to the fact that there are more scholarly attempts to justify these visions, and these attempts are linked to political claims. Just to drop one name, it is Kamal Salibi, who is a distinguished former professor of AUB, of the American University of Beirut, who currently serves as the head of the Interfaith Institute in Amman. And he claims, and in quite a scholarly, although in my opinion not convincing way, goes even further than the minimalists. He says that the Hebrew Bible is a Hellenistic production, and the whole notion of a Jewish temple in Jerusalem goes actually back to the Maccabees, and is therefore too a Hellenistic claim, and therefore quite a recent one. Although I do fully agree with you that the question when exactly the first temple or the second temple was built does in no way question the Jewish claim to that claim.
Jack Laster, further to this point.
Yes, first of all, I want to praise Ben for his paper. I don't know, being a pedant of the worst sort, usually if someone asks me a question, it takes about 45 minutes to get warmed up before I can articulate the answer. For Ben to have sat there in about 40 minutes and taken this highly complex and very difficult subject, which requires a familiarity not only with philology and philological method, but also with archaeology and anthropology and the like, and to distill it into something which is understandable to a general audience and useful to a scholarly audience as well is really quite remarkable. So that's my first comment. Now, having said that, I'd like to pick up where the other interlocutors have gone, and that is that the minimalists have seized upon this particular issue, and some of them are less responsible than others, and some of them are driven by political concepts and produce tendentiously driven arguments on the basis of that. The most egregious of them all probably is Whitelam, who writes a book on the silencing of Palestinian history. The title of the book, let alone the subtitle, is sufficient to tell you where he's going with this. And the issue for Whitelam is not whether it's the 7th century or the 8th century or the 9th century or the 10th century or what have you. The issue for Whitelam is the very existence of an ancient Israelite people. Because for Whitelam, what you have is a migration of a non-indigenous people coming into Palestine in the Hellenistic era that usurps the rights of the indigenous inhabitants who are the Palestinians. So in effect, the argument would be that the ancient Israelites, if there were ancient Israelites, are people that come from the outside, and in fact the indigenous inhabitants are the ancient Palestinians. Now for Whitelam, there is no Arab conquest of the 7th century. That's an incidental event of no consequence whatsoever. The current Palestinians are indeed their ancestors are the ancient Canaanites. Now, to some extent, one can probably make that argument because we could also argue that the ancient Israelites have as their descendants ancient Canaanites as well. But the argument here is taken to a different. There are different conclusions to be drawn, and that is, of course, that this is juxtaposed with the current situation, in which the argument is that another group of a non-indigenous population has come to Palestine, namely the Zionists from Eastern Europe, and they are simply recreating the situation that existed in more ancient times by dispossessing on the one hand and then usurping the rights to the land of the indigenous inhabitants that have been there since time immemorial, namely the Canaanites. Now, the linkage between the culture of present Palestinians and that of the Canaanites is another matter altogether. Now, we can argue that Whitelam is tendentiously driven, and he really is a very shoddy scholar in certain respects, as are several of the other minimalists. But the fact of the matter is that scholarship is not a terribly important factor in publishing work today about these matters. Particularly when this sort of scholarship is picked up in dribs and drabs by individuals in other scholarly disciplines, which I don't know quite how to say this because some of my colleagues may be sitting here, areas like literary studies and anthropology, which are not so rigorously interested in fine-tuning the philological and the archaeological debates and the like. And the end result is you have things like a journal like the publication of the Modern Language Association, which is the flagship journal of 13,000 card-carrying members or more of the study of literature, an article by a specialist in 19th century American literature teaching at Berzeit University by the name of Basim Rad, who regurgitates all of this business and completely makes a mishmash of any sort of responsible scholarship, and this is an article that passes review in such a journal and is published. And recently I've had cause also to write a review of a book by an anthropologist that deals with Israeli uses of archaeology. There are no scholarly breaks when it comes to this sort of thing, and more people read that than unfortunately read the very sober and excellent scholarship of people that are represented at this particular table. So what I'm simply trying to reinforce is that what Ben says is absolutely true, and it's important to say this. And this is the tension of this particular conference. We have the tension here of trying, on the one hand, to do what we do. And what we do is to try and approach scholarly problems from a scholarly point of view and try and to consciously ask ourselves all the time, whether we are in fact doing things in a responsible sort of way. And the problem is that on the one hand we do that in the conference, but on the other hand we're confronted with the fact that regardless of what we say at this particular conference, these scholarly matters are translated elsewhere into a very different kind of discourse and very different kind of dialogue. And on the one hand, we don't want to spend our time simply talking about that discourse and the dialogue. We want to spend our time doing what we like to do, namely responsible scholarship. But I think we have to, in a sense, recognize that's there and give ample amount of time to address this as well. And Salibi, by the way, may be a very responsible scholar, but he was a responsible scholar as a professor of Islamic history and not of Bible. I mean, what Salibi does in this particular book would make a responsible philologist blanch. So,
Ben, go ahead.
A few responses. First of all, I think that it's useful to recognize that in the comments that were just made and in my own paper, there are really two, I think, distinct issues that are coming up, and we need to deal with each of them distinctly on its own. One issue has to do with the political use and misuse of scholarship. And the point that I was trying to make in the paper, which I gather people are not disagreeing with, is simply that even if the most extreme versions of the minimalist position are true, this is actually not a fact that has any relevance whatsoever to real political concerns. That doesn't mean that there aren't people who want to misuse it that way. It may even be the case, I think in Whitlam's case he comes out of the closet and says this to some degree, that one of the motivating factors behind some minimalist scholars' work is in fact the political use that their work can be put to. But in fact, if that's the case, nevertheless, it really just doesn't matter. So Jewish national identity was invented in the 4th century, or maybe the 2nd century BCE, rather than the 10th or the 15th. It could be the case that Jewish national consciousness was invented in the 19th century CE. None of this would have, I think, any meaningful role in evaluating the competing claims of two people to a single piece of real estate. Those claims endure regardless of when those claims really began. It is the case that people will misuse this work. There's nothing that we can do about that. That's just a fact. And I, for one, don't see the use in talking about the misuse of nonsense. Much less, I don't really see a lot of point in talking about the misuse of good scholarship, all the more so the misuse of nonsense. Both good scholarship and nonsense will always be misused rhetorically. There's nothing we can do about that. We can only note that fact and move on with our lives. The other issue that comes up is not just the political use of scholarship, but the nature of the scholarship itself. My old friend and colleague Martin refers to the scholarly nature of some of these arguments. Here I've got to ask the question, well, what do we mean by a genuine scholarly argument? The literature that I've read, I haven't read the professor from Amman to whom you refer, the literature that I have read, Whitlam, Thompson, Davies, and so forth, I suppose you could say it's a scholarly discourse in that there are footnotes and bibliographies, but the use of evidence and the mode of reasoning in those books and in those articles, in spite of the presence of footnotes and occasionally the word ibid, is simply not scholarly. The use of epigraphy, paleography, historical linguistics, stratigraphy, and the analysis of ancient texts is just not scholarly. And on this there is well-nigh unanimity within the field of biblical scholarship. I mean, if people are curious, I could go on to go give some examples. I'll just throw out one, I think, fairly typical example from the work of Davies. One of the problems in the minimalist argument is that scholars have identified different types of ancient Hebrew, just as Chaucer's English is identifiably different from Shakespeare's and Shakespeare's from ours. So too, there are identifiable differences between pre-exilic and post-exilic Hebrew. There's been very careful work done on this by a variety of scholars throughout the world. Now, and the differences are evident not only in biblical texts, but also in inscriptions that have been uncovered. And you can see that there are differences between the inscriptions of pre-exilic and post-exilic Hebrew, which match up with the differences you find in pre-exilic and post-exilic documents in the Hebrew Bible itself. The existence of a stratified Hebrew language, the fact that pre-exilic and post-exilic Hebrew are different from each other, completely vitiates the claims of the minimalists. Now, at some point, fairly late in the game, Davies suddenly realized this, and Davies gave a paper, which he was kind enough to send to me, on the work of the leading scholar, Avi Horvitz, the leading scholar on the history of the Hebrew language, in which he brutally attacks Horvitz for all sorts of flaws in his argumentation. To give an example of one of the attacks, he says, well, Horvitz's work addresses prose but not poetry. And of course, there are major differences between the way poetry and prose work, and therefore the absence of a discussion of poetry in the creation of this theory shows that Horvitz's theory is completely illegitimate and we can safely ignore it. In fact, Avi Horvitz wrote not one, but 2 books on the dating of Hebrew poetry. His entire method began with his doctoral dissertation, which was later published as a book, on the dating of the poetry of Psalms. It was only later on that he began to extend the method to prose. When you've got a scholar who's saying, well, we can throw out Horvitz's work because he didn't pay attention to major issue X, and in fact he wrote 2 books about X, this is simply a kind of scholarly malfeasance that shows that we're not dealing with scholarship at all. And I could go through page after page after page of the work of Davies and Thompson, giving further examples of this kind. The presence of footnotes does not make something scholarship. Two other comments along these lines. It is the case, on the one hand, as I've noted, that within the field of biblical studies, the work of Davies, Thompson, Whitlam, and Lemke has been roundly rejected. And by the way, here I'm talking, by the way, about the recent work of these scholars. In the case of Thompson wrote a very important book in the 1970s that has been very, very widely accepted by scholars and is very influential in the field. Lemke also wrote some very important works in the 70s and 80s, really in the 80s. I'm talking about their specific claims in their recent work. Now, it's been rejected by biblical scholars, by ancient Near Eastern scholars. Nonetheless, it has been picked up by literary critics, by theorists. Speaking personally as a biblical scholar, I'm not sure why I should care that people who specialize in postmodernist literary criticism and philosophy in France admire the discussions by Davies of epigraphy. The fact that somebody who doesn't really know what epigraphy is thinks that Davies' comments on epigraphy are cogent, how is this relevant to me as a biblical scholar? If, let's say, some English professor published a book suggesting that John Milton did not write Paradise Lost, but in fact that Paradise Lost was really written by Evelyn Waugh in the middle of the 20th century, most English professors would note that this is a thesis that has to overcome considerable hurdles and probably would not have overcome those hurdles, I'm willing to bet. Now, if I as a biblical scholar then came out and said, well, I think that this is really cool. I think that, yeah, Evelyn Waugh wrote Paradise Lost, and this may be very, very significant in some ways in terms of a Protestant-Catholic debate. I mean, how could a Congregationalist have written such a wonderful and learned work? It had to have been written by a Catholic. Also, it has to have been written by a Catholic in the 20th century who has easy access to a wide variety of texts to which this alludes. And yeah, maybe I could come out and write an article about this, but it's not clear to me why any English professor would care that Benjamin Summer agrees that with the thesis that Waugh wrote Paradise Lost. I find myself in precisely the same boat when it comes to the proceedings of the Modern Language Association's interest in minimalist biblical scholarship. People who know about the issues at hand are unanimous in rejecting this sort of scholarship, and indeed I don't think it's really technically correct to refer to their works as scholarship, the presence of the word opsite notwithstanding. Actually, one last remark on the political uses of archaeology, because as Michael's pointing out, the political uses of archaeology and misuses happen on both sides of the coin. And it's been pointed out that there's an engine driving some of the archaeology done in Israel a lot of this has to do with selection. What was Yadin interested in? And actually, Whitlam brings up this point, and to some degree, it's a legitimate point. I mean, Whitlam takes it in directions that make no sense. But what does a scholar actually attend to? What strata do you pause and really analyze closely, the Israelite strata or the Canaanite strata? Nonetheless, I do think that this point has been made sometimes in a facile way, and in a way that's a little bit selective. To take this example of Yadin's work is part of an academic tradition. Like all academics, he wrote his books, he wrote his articles. Later scholars came along and wrote their books and articles. And what one finds in Israel, in fact, is that there doesn't seem to be any master Zionist narrative that's pushing archaeological research, because people are perfectly willing to disagree with Yadin's conclusions, and they're able to get tenure, and they're even able to get promoted to full professor, which in Israel is not an easy thing to do. In the case of Finkelstein and Usishkin is a fine case in point. These are two Israeli scholars who, in fact, have come out very clearly and disagreed with Yadin, and it doesn't seem to have gotten them expelled from the state of Israel. I mentioned very briefly in my paper the recently discovered Yehoash inscription. A great inscription if you want to get some Zionist propaganda relevant to the issues of the day. If it were the case that there's some sort of master Israeli narrative, you would expect that lots of Israeli scholars would say, "Yep, this is a genuine inscription." It is in fact the Israeli scholars who quickly pronounced it a forgery. Ed Greenstein from Tel Aviv University wrote a very fine article indicating that from the point of view of what we know about the difference between pre-exilic and post-exilic Hebrew, it's clear that this is not a pre-exilic document. In fact, it's clear that this is a document written by somebody who knows modern Hebrew. Other Israeli scholars looking at other issues, including epigraphy, also indicated that this is a forgery. The Israeli Government Archaeology Office, which, if there should be any group that is politically driven, declared it to be a forgery, and the Israeli police are investigating to try and figure out who forged this thing. It's easy to take a couple of examples and say, well, we can dismiss Israeli archaeology because all the Israeli archaeologists aren't really interested in finding what's in the dirt. They're just interested in creating an ideological narrative. In fact, when you look at the wealth of Israeli archaeology, it turns out that Israeli archaeology is much, much more complex than that, and Israeli archaeologists are happy to call a spade, even when, actually, spades, didn't intend that one. Even when the spade in question would have been helpful to Zionist propaganda.
Can we go on to questions for Professor Lassner, or go ahead.
Mohammed Muslih from Long Island.
Thank you. Just one point I'd like to make by way of suggestion with regard to Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah is very controversial, and one has really to be very careful in analyzing his fatwas or his opinions. As you know, he's heavily quoted by some of the most radical Islamic movements as well as by the most moderate and mainstream Islamic movements. And many of his fatwas were given for mere physical survival at that time. So the point I'm trying to make by just as a suggestion, one has to look at the context in which Ibn Fatwa made a particular opinion or statement, the circumstances, the timing, and whether he changed it later or not.
Just before you respond to Jack, any other questions to Jack Lassner? Martin Jacobs. And then we'll come back to you, Bill.
Yes, I would like to refer to the Fadail and books. As you refer to, the most important texts of the Fadail books actually go back to Zangi ad-Din Nur, to the time of Zangi ad-Din Nur ad-Din and Salah ad-Din Saladin, who retook Jerusalem, and they reflect the time of the Crusades. So my question is linked to the issue at which time and under what circumstances does the consciousness of the sacredness of a special place, of peoplehood, and the importance of a sanctuary come up. And if it is true, and you know that better than me, that the virtues of Jerusalem, the Fadala puts, are especially linked to the time of the competition between the Crusader claim and the Muslim claim on Jerusalem, then this would have an impact on our present day discussion. Does the awareness of the sanctity of a place come up at times of competition? Is it shaped by competition? And how do we deal with it if that would be the case?
Jack Lester?
Yeah, I'll answer the second question first, and that is you'll find out this afternoon, because the the paper I'm giving this afternoon, which is the paper that the only paper I thought I was going to be giving at this conference, deals with the sanctification of Jerusalem in light of medieval politics. So there's no sense in talking about that now, and those of you who will not be here this afternoon, that'll be a mystery still. But I'll address that issue later on. One methodological question here, and that is one has to be very cautious when one talks in medieval Arabic sources about the dates of particular traditions. An old tradition may find its way in a much later text. That is to say, in the time of the Crusaders, a whole series of earlier traditions were brought together for purposes of combating this particular menace, and it's no small accident that these traditions have been once again brought to the forth and produced and published once the Israelis have occupied Jerusalem after 1967. So the very date of publication, or the very date, not publication, but the dating of the author who preserves traditions does not necessarily indicate that this is the date of the traditions themselves. Older traditions are preserved in later texts, and later traditions are also preserved by older authors who have been redacted by later editors who throw in material that is not in the particular text as well. But that's a problem that anybody who works in a very conscious way and responsible way with medieval Arabic sources has to deal with. On the question of Ibn Taymiyyah, I'm extremely careful. I'm very cautious about these sorts of things. Were Ibn Taymiyyah the only authority who addressed this particular issue, were his work on pilgrimage to Jerusalem, or the rules governing visits to Jerusalem, the only work that we had, then this would be an intellectual curio that would have to be presented in that particular way. But we have an enormous literature dealing with this particular subject, going back to early historians in the Islamic world who preserve still earlier historical memory. So there's no question that there is a Fadail al-Quds literature, and there's also an anti-Fadail al-Quds literature, and it goes back very, very early, and some of the circumstances I would like to suggest perhaps this afternoon, if we can wait that long.
All right, Pamela, Baramash, and then Ambassador Mehav.
I know that the questions have been directed at Ben regarding the misuse of scholarship or pseudo-scholarship, and I'd like actually to address some of the content of the real scholarship. Now, it's interesting to see really a shift in focus. I have three questions regarding that. A real shift in focus. We have this romance with origins, with David and Solomon. And I think the corrective of Finkelstein, Ushishkin, Baruch Halpern is to remind us that there were other important monarchs who built and developed the city, such as Hezekiah and Josiah. And certainly the interest of Finkelstein and Ushishkin is to remind us that in fact the northern kingdom was more populous, was more economically powerful, was closer to the major trade routes, and just because of geographical location. So to actually shift the focus and to, what happens when you shift the focus is not that you create more balance. What happens, the pendulum swings from one side to another, so that at one time everyone's focused on David and Solomon, and then when you switch it to talk about Omri and the northern kingdom, so there's a downgrading of the early period. And so one thing to remember is, in fact, when you're talking about the period from 1000 to 587 and 86, is that there was more than just David and Solomon. There were these other kings, and those are the ones who we have interest in biblical material from. We have a king Manasseh who reigned for 55 years during a very difficult political situation, who is condemned and given very little time in our text, who probably was perhaps a more politically savvy king than we have information about. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, Jerusalem in this time period was a bureaucratic city. Now, we have a bureaucratic city here in the United States. It's Washington, D.C. I don't think there's a city that's more reviled in American culture than Washington, D.C. So the question is, how does a city which is the center of bureaucracy become the subject of utopian dreams, of religious, or dare I use the word, spiritual visions? So how does the city from which royal orders, to which taxes are brought, corvée, forced labor orders are sent out and people brought in, how does this city become transformed in at least the text that we have to this exalted city, a city which has as its temple mount this sort of low mountain which, sort of has a hill with attitude that just sort of gets inflated tremendously. And then the third thing I want to point out is, and I guess really is a response to Yaron Eliav, but also to what you have to say. We talk about this period as sort of, and focus on the temple in Jerusalem as that which makes the city important. But, the truth is, even our biblical text, Solomon spends 13 years building his palace, and he spends 7 years building, should I say, the chapel attached to his palace. So what in the world did he care more about? His palace or that chapel that we call the temple? There are questions in those three comments.
Ambassador Merkov.
I wish to bring up a subject which is perhaps beyond the scope of this conference, but I dare doing so because I'm more of a practitioner than a scholar. I'm a student, actually. There was a very interesting remark by Professor Lassner regarding if I remember it correctly, that politicians may say what they say and scholarship should go on, and scholars should go on, if I got the gist of the thing. And I think that in recent years, especially with regard to Jerusalem, we had a very tragic, or let's say, I would say deplorable encounter between scholars and politicians in that respect. And I'm referring to meetings at Camp David, where the Israeli foreign minister, a brilliant scholar by himself, in his own right, Professor Ben-Ami, who was then the foreign minister, encountered the allegation or the submissions by Arafat and then by his lieutenants that there was no temple at all. And this brings up very sad reflections. In such a case, when an astute politician or a politician who thinks that that's his last escape, or perhaps sometimes the imagination is the last escape of politicians when they are in dire straits, when they bring up such a story of Al-Haikal al-Ma'zum, the imagined temple, and then you just stand there and look at them and think where in hell did they get it from, and you may know that, or we may know that when these people say these things, they believe in them. So, is there any duty, or is it incumbent upon scholars in such a case somehow to get up against the great lie, because the big lie? Because this is really a question, and believe you me that within some parts of the Palestinian body politic, and the Arab body politic, these assumptions are now rooted, deeply rooted, and it will take years perhaps to erase them. And I'm just putting a question mark. I have no answer to that.
Thank you. That's a very serious question, goes to the heart of this conference as well. Does it make a difference what it is that we do in the academy? We'll begin with responses. Ben, do you want to begin? And then Jack?
I'll defer to Jack on this one.
Since my name was last mentioned, I hope I didn't give anyone the impression that I feel that academicians should do what they do and be oblivious to what else is going on in the world. I myself am not so calm in my reaction, as my wife will testify, when it comes to reading articles like that of Bassem Rad in the publication of the Modern Language Association, or in reviewing Nadia Abul-Hajj's book on the archaeology, the Israeli misuses of archaeologists. I'm outraged, because I think this is a scholarly obscenity, and unfortunately more people will read those books than read my scholarly books, especially if my press keeps the price at $65 a book. I should add that I think it's imperative for scholars to become actively involved in trying to clear the air when it comes to certain of these major issues, and not wishing to sell my own books here. I must add that Ilan Troen and I are now in the process of trying to complete a book in which these issues are taken up in several chapters, and the book is written in accessible prose. And it's designed to be read by a general audience, and with no footnotes and a bibliography. So we're going to be accused, on the one hand, of scholars of trivializing all sorts of very, very difficult and arcane scholarly discussions, including the nature of sources and the like. We'll be accused of other scholars of tendentiously using the material at our command and so forth. But in the final analysis, we hope that this will clear the air on certain basic issues. But I have to say that given the nature of what goes on, certainly in the American Academy today, the sort of slogging against all the amateurs who have taken an active interest in these particular issues, not all of them because of scholarly reasons, is daunting, absolutely daunting. And it's for that reason that we hold conferences of this sort at the university. And I would dare say that some of the people on our own faculty who could benefit from attending this particular conference, given what they have talked about in their own scholarly views, are conspicuous by their absence at the present moment. So it's not an easy task, but I don't want to give the impression that scholars should simply have a blind eye to all of this. They should take an active interest and try and reach an accessible audience as well. Not at the extent of giving up their own scholarly careers, but it's a problem.
Just very quickly, on this point, I think we're not simply talking about scholars and politicians, we're talking about society also. Yes. Society itself creates its own myths and its own beliefs which cannot be rooted in reality. And the question that arises is, what is the role of politicians and what is the role of scholars in demystifying these myths?
Michael, and then I think we're going to close now because we do have to eat. There's a lot more to listen to this afternoon.
I think I would add, going back to Ben's responses to us, that in a sense there are multiple grounds of scholarship here too. One ground of scholarship is archaeology and biblical texts. Some of us who do cultural history or political history simply take the phenomenon as a ground of scholarship. So we're not simply talking about uses or misuses of scholarship, but just for example, as I could write about the protocols of the elders of Zion as a historical phenomenon, so also it's worth bearing in mind, and that was the gist of my original comment, that there is this phenomenon of the politicization of archaeology and biblical studies, which in one sense, not irrespective of whether it's good or bad scholarship, but simply as a phenomenon taken as a whole, is worth examination because it tells us something about how people create foundational myths, how people create competing formational narratives, and all of those kinds of things, which are not perhaps particularly crucial to ancient Near Eastern or biblical scholarship, but are highly crucial to scholarship involving the creation of modern nation states, whether they're the United States or the State of Israel, because both do similar kinds of things using frequently enough the same texts. And that was the thought that was behind my initial comment.
Well, then I'll conclude with an anecdote. And the anecdote is as follows. It's impossible to imagine the Balfour Declaration and its acceptance by the international community at that time without an acceptance of the very traditional origin myth, if you like, or origin narrative, or origin story, or origin text of Jews as having a deep and intimate connection with the Holy Land. At the same time, by the 1930s, that connection was so well perceived and seen as such a threat to a Palestinian condition that one can read in the last chapter of Antonius's The Arab Awakening, the beginning of what is really a consistent attack on the connection between Jews and the Holy Land. So that by 1948, when Ben-Gurion, who articulates the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel, in that first paragraph, he concludes that first paragraph in the third sentence, one that you left out in your presentation, Ben, with here, they wrote and gave the book to the world. Somehow in 1948, the need to create a state was so powerful, so necessary, that even rabbis signed that document. Mm-hmm. I can testify that as director of the Ben-Gurion Research Institute in 1986, which was the centenary of Ben-Gurion's death, we thought we would do a very American thing, which was to have a renewal of vows. We thought we would have the citizens of the State of Israel affix their signatures to the Declaration of Independence. We learned within several days that that was an utter impossibility. We could not get people to sign Israel's Declaration of Independence. The reason was the third sentence of the first paragraph, because the notion that they wrote, the people wrote the book here and gave it to the world, contravened several thousand years of belief. And in 1986, a religious Jew could not sign the Declaration. Even in 1948, they most certainly did. So that the permutations in beliefs and attitudes towards history and the uses of scholarship undergoes far more fine modulation than this long sweep, the long durée that we've had this morning might suggest.